The ring came back before the soldier did. That was the part the Orc court never quite recovered from. Not the battle, not the surrender, not even the moment the human named Davin Voss walked through the gates of the Kethral Palace with a white cloth in one hand and 7 years of starlight carved into his face. What broke them open, every chancellor and war chief and high scribe seated in that vast stone amphitheater, was the ring. Rusted, pitted. The band so thin from years of turning it between fingers and thumb that the metal had worn transparent in 2 places, letting the amber light of the Kethral capital through like windows in old bone. He laid it on the offering table with both hands, the way you set down something that has kept you alive. And the gatekeeper prime, who had not wept since the sundering 3 centuries ago, made a sound in his throat that had no name in any language. Not in Kethral, not in the human trade tongue, not in the old stone speech of the mountain clans. A sound that was not grief and not joy, and was not reducible to any single emotion that any species in the known systems had yet bothered to name. A sound that meant, roughly, in the closest approximation available, I did not know we could be undone by something this small. None of them did. This is how it happened. This is how one human being, carrying a ring that was worth less than the cord it hung on, walked into the center of the most formidable military civilization in the outer systems, and made 500 Kethral warriors understand, for the first time in their entire species' history, that they had been missing a piece of themselves they hadn't known was gone. 7 years before that table, Davin Voss was not remarkable. He was 34, middle rank in the Terran Expeditionary Fleet, specifically a logistics specialist, 2nd class, which meant his most significant daily contribution to the war effort involved manifests, cargo routing, and the deeply satisfying work of tracking down requisitions that had been filed in triplicate and still managed to get lost. He was assigned to the outer rim station on Gorev's moon when the Kethral assault came. He had a wife named Sorrel back on Earth, and a daughter named Pell who was 5 years old, and had recently mastered the art of negotiating extra bedtime by asking an endless series of questions that grew increasingly philosophical toward the end, which Davin had found exhausting and magnificent. He had a photograph of both of them magnetized to his locker, Sorrel in the harbor light with her arms around Pell, who was mid-laugh and blur, and he'd looked at it every morning for 4 years before the Kethral stripped the station down to bare metal and marched the survivors in chains across 3-star systems. He had a ring, his grandmother's. He'd carried it since her funeral, 7 years before the war started, so 14 years total in his possession. He'd meant to have it resized and given to Sorrel on their 5th anniversary, a plan that had gotten delayed by the assignment to Gorev's moon, and then by the war, and then by events he hadn't anticipated. The ring was too small for any of his fingers now, worn thin by his grandmother's decades of use, so he wore it on a cord around his neck, under his collar, against his sternum, where it sat through every jump and decompression and firefight and cargo audit. A cold circle of weight he barely noticed anymore except when he slept, when it would shift and press and remind him. The Kethral took everything else: tools, credentials, navigation chips, the photograph. They were thorough. The Kethral are always thorough. Their strip search protocol had been developed over centuries of conquest and refined with each new species, and it missed very little. It missed the ring because Davin swallowed it. He had about 30 seconds of warning between the breach alarm and the boarding team reaching his corridor, which was not enough time to do anything useful except make one instinctive decision. He looked at the locker. He looked at the ring on his bunk where he'd laid it out that morning while cleaning the cord. He picked it up and swallowed it. It was not comfortable. He recovered it 3 days later, in a Kethral processing camp on the 3rd moon of the Veth system, in circumstances he never described to anyone in detail except once, to let him mourn years later, when they were both drunk on distilled camp rations, and she'd asked directly, and he'd felt that the story in that context had earned being told. She'd laughed so hard she fell off her bunk. He took the ring back, cleaned it with the hem of his shirt, slowly, carefully, with the focused attention of someone performing a ritual whether they mean to or not. He threaded it back onto the cord. He tucked it under his collar. The Kethral guard who watched this process from across the compound wrote a 3-line log entry. Detainee recovered and cleaned personal item from waste. Significance unclear, monitoring. None of them knew what to make of that. They filed it away. The Kethral are not what the newscasts called them. The newscasts called them monsters, and the word was not wrong exactly, just insufficient in the way that calling a storm a weather event is insufficient. They are 7 feet of gray-green muscle and layered bone plate, with 4 arms, 2 of which end in manipulator clusters capable of threading a needle or cracking a hull seam with equal precision. Their eyes are gold, the iris a vertical slit that contracts to a thread in bright light and opens to something vast and strange in darkness. They communicate in layered harmonics, 3 or 4 tones stacked simultaneously, so that a single Kethral statement carries its surface meaning, its emotional valence, its social rank assertion, and an embedded memory echo of the last time that speaker said something similar, all at once, all layered in a chord that humans experience as a rich and deeply uncomfortable vibration, music played in a room slightly too small for it. They have a ceremony. Every civilization that reaches sufficient complexity develops ceremonies for grief, ways of marking loss, of making absence legible. The Kethral ceremony has been in place for longer than their recorded history, which means it predates writing, which means it was important enough to keep doing even before anyone thought to write things down. The ceremony involves the bonding object, a physical item carried by a warrior, defined not by value but by continuous contact and intentional meaning assignment. When a warrior dies, the bonding object is carried back to their lineage by someone who witnesses the death. The carrying back is everything. To bring the object back is to say, they existed, they mattered, what was lost is acknowledged. Without the return, the lineage cannot complete the grief cycle, cannot close what was opened, cannot, in the Kethral word that has no human equivalent, continue. 500 years of conquest, 12 species catalogued and classified, hundreds of worlds. They had never encountered a species that performed this ceremony, or any version of it, or anything that resembled it from any angle. They had no word for what Davin Voss was doing, not yet. The camp on Veth 3 held 412 humans when Davin arrived. By the end of the first year it held 307. The Kethral were not systematically cruel. Cruelty requires a kind of sustained investment they didn't make. They were indifferent in the way a glacier is indifferent. Nothing personal, nothing targeted, just an enormous pressure that ground things down without caring what it ground. The cold was the cold. The rations were the rations. The sleeping quarters were sized for Kethral bunks, and therefore too large for humans to retain body heat, and too numerous to actually assign to individuals, which meant the population arranged itself by proximity, and then by inertia, and then by a kind of exhausted tribalism that formed in weeks and hardened in months and was, by year's end, the only social architecture most of them could remember. The camp commander was designated Commander Gale. The humans had other names for him, most of them more colorful. He was responsible for processing, cataloging, and extracting labor from the human population. He was very good at this work. He had done it for 3 other species and found humans the most predictable of the lot, deprived them of enough for long enough and they became simple, controllable. They stopped looking at each other. They turned inward and went quiet and could be managed with minimal resource expenditure. He had written this in his reports. He was right about most people. He was wrong about Davin Voss. What Davin did in that first year was not heroic. Let's be precise about that. He didn't organize a resistance cell or smuggle medicine or coordinate a breakout plan. He didn't make a rousing speech or stand down a guard or sacrifice himself for someone else in any moment that would have made good footage for a memorial. He did something stranger and, in the long view, considerably more dangerous. He kept track of every person in the camp. Name, bunk location, origin station, condition, skill set. He memorized it all, updated it daily, cross-referenced it against the work assignments the Kethral posted and the ration allocations and the medical callouts. And when people started to disappear, when the Kethral would call someone for processing and they wouldn't come back, he would say their name out loud that evening, to whoever was close enough to hear. Just the name. Sometimes the origin station. Sometimes one specific thing about them, the most specific thing he could recall. Harris from Gorev 6 used to fix the water recyclers before his posting. He had a specific trick for the mineral buildup in the secondary filters that worked better than the manufacturer's method. And he had a son named Tal who was 9 years old and wanted to be a pilot. The other humans thought he was losing his mind. Then they thought he was performing some kind of memorial. Then they started correcting him when he got details wrong. No, she was from Callisto Station, not Ceres. She told me her 3rd day here. And then they started adding details he didn't have. And then they started saying the names with him, quietly in the evenings, like a roll call that no one had officially assigned, but that everyone somehow knew was necessary. By the end of the 1st year, when Urgale's report filed to command, stated that the human population had fragmented and turned inward, and showed the predicted reduction in collective resistance markers, Davin had memorized 307 names, and the Kethral guards had started to notice that the humans were not looking inward at all. They were looking at each other, quietly and constantly, with an expression that Urgale's classification database labeled as *unresolvable, pending further data. He filed it under anomalous behavioral observation and flagged it for review. He was not wrong to flag it. He just didn't know yet what he was looking at. The ring became visible in the 2nd year. It happened because of a woman named Letta Morn, who had been a navigation specialist on a deep system survey vessel, and who was, by the 2nd year of captivity, very close to the edge of whatever you fall off when you've been pushed long enough and hard enough, and the thing you were holding onto most tightly has been taken most efficiently. She stopped eating. She stopped talking. She sat in her bunk with her knees pulled up, and her eyes pointed at the wall behind a face that had gone from expression to surface, like a window someone had painted over from the inside. Davin knew what that face meant. He'd seen it 3 times before in the camp in those early months before he understood what to do about it. The 3 times he hadn't known what to do about it, the people wearing that face had been gone within 2 weeks. Transferred, officially. He said their names in the evenings. He wasn't going to say Letta Morn's name in the evenings. He sat beside her bunk. He had nothing to give her. They all had nothing. That was the condition of the camp, the constant mathematical fact of it. But he reached under his collar and pulled out the ring on its cord and held it where she could see it without having to move her head. She didn't look at it at first. Then slowly she did. It was small, corroded, a thing of no consequence. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice had the texture of a room that hasn't been used in a while. "My grandmother's," he said. "She gave it to me the week before she died." "Well, she didn't give it to me exactly. I found it in an envelope she'd left. The envelope said my name on it. She'd written inside for keeping." He turned the ring over in his fingers. "I spent 3 years trying to figure out what that meant, what exactly she wanted me to keep. The ring, obviously, but the ring it's just metal, so I think she meant something else. I think she meant," he stopped. He looked at the ring. "I think she meant me. She wanted me to keep myself. And she thought having the thing she'd touched every day of her life might make that easier." Letta looked at the ring. She said nothing. Her breathing had changed slightly, less shallow than it had been. He set the ring down on the edge of her bunk, right at the boundary of her space, where she could reach it without effort. "She used to say that the people who love us don't go anywhere when they die," he said. "They just go quiet. And if you pay attention, really pay attention, the specific kind that's harder than anything else, you can still hear them. In the things they left. in the habits they gave you without meaning to. Letta Morn looked at the ring for a long time. Then she reached out and picked it up. Her fingers closed around it. He left it with her overnight. She ate in the morning. She handed the ring back with both hands. He took it with both hands. Neither of them said anything about it. He threaded it back on the cord and put it under his collar. And that was that, except that it wasn't, because Letta Morn started paying attention after that. Started watching the camp with her navigator's eyes and her navigator's habit of tracking vectors and calculating trajectories. And she became one of his steadiest and most indispensable allies for the next 5 years, which was something he hadn't planned and something he thought about later, quietly, when he was trying to understand what the ring actually was. The Kethral guard Siveth had been watching from across the compound. He filed a log entry, unexplained object transfer ritual between detainees, object returned following one sleep cycle, significance unknown. His supervisor marked the entry as low priority. Siveth kept watching anyway. He was young and new, and the posting was his first, and he had been told by his training commanders that humans were simple and predictable once resource pressure was applied, and he was finding that this was approximately 40% true and 60% something that had no name in his training materials. He filed a lot of log entries that year. His supervisor stopped reading them. Siveth kept writing them. By the 3rd year, the ring traveled. Not permanently, Davin was clear about that, with each person always clear. You can have it for one night, one sleep, give it back in the morning, and they always did. He couldn't have explained why he was certain they would, except that he was, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from logic, but from something older than logic. Some knowledge you accumulate through skin and proximity, and the long, slow education of paying attention to other people. They gave it back because of what the loan meant. Not the object was nothing. The loan was everything. In a place designed to strip every resource down to zero, to reduce every relationship to competition for whatever little existed, the act of giving something away freely with trust, with the open-handed faith that it would be returned, was so far outside the expected architecture that it reconfigured things. The receipt of it was disorienting. The return of it was clarifying. Something had been given. Something had been honored. A tiny mechanical exchange that proved the mechanism still worked, that the thing the camp was trying to kill had not, in fact, died. A man named Jorav held it for 3 nights during a grief crisis, following the notification that his entire home station had been decommissioned. A woman named Cyan held it the week before giving testimony to the Kethral assessment teams, when her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold her own cup. A pair of brothers named Tesh and Orem each held it on different nights in the same week, without coordination, which Davin discovered when he went to Tesh first, and Tesh said, quietly, that Orem had asked last night, and he thought Orem needed it more and he could wait. He couldn't explain why. Hearing this, Davin had to look away for a moment. Urgail noticed the ring in the 3rd year. A dying human named Peter, origin station Gorev 6, age indeterminate, one of the original 412, refused medical triage until the ring was brought to him. The camp medic filed a report that reached Urgail's desk and prompted him, for the first time, to cross-reference the ring across his operational logs. He found 17 separate references. The same small object, moving through the camp population, always returned, always associated with stabilized behavioral markers in the recipient. He opened his species database. He queried human-object bonding and behavioral outcomes, 14 academic papers. He read 6. He queried ritual object transfer and cooperative behavior in non-technological contexts, 8 more papers. He read all 8. He sat in his command center for a long time looking at the reports. Then he wrote in the margin of his notes, in the cramped formal script of the High Court administrative class from which he'd come, "This is not what I was told to expect." He flagged the camp for a court scholar review. This was unusual. It caused a great deal of administrative confusion in the High Court receiving office. Eventually, the flag was processed and assigned, and a scholar was dispatched, because the High Court processing staff, reading the supporting materials, found that they too could not identify an existing category for the thing being described. The fourth year was the hardest. Word arrived through the fractured prisoner grapevine, through Kethral broadcast news that guards sometimes left running, through scraps and fragments that filtered in through 100 small cracks that no processing camp ever fully sealed, that Earth had lost the belt. The 3 inhabited stations of the asteroid belt had fallen. The Kethral forward fleet had reached the inner system. There were rumors of negotiations, surrender terms being drafted, entire populations being reclassified from protected status to unprotected. The camp went very quiet. Davin sat in the center of it and felt the silence pressing in from every direction. The specific weight of 240 people who had just been handed something they'd been afraid of since the beginning and were now holding it in both hands, not knowing what to do next. He thought about Sorrel, who he hadn't heard from in 2 years. The last transmission had been a brief recorded message, censored to meaninglessness by the Kethral content filters, that said she and Pell were well and not to worry, and she was proud of him, all of which was clearly true, and all of which told him nothing he most needed to know. He thought about Pell, who was 9 years old now and who had, by this point, spent nearly half her remembered life without her father present. He thought about the photograph that had been taken, and stopped that thought before it went where it was going. He turned the ring on its cord. He thought about his grandmother's voice, which he had started to confuse with his own internal voice. They had similar rhythms, similar habits of phrasing, and 14 years of carrying her ring in close contact with his own chest had apparently led to some kind of osmotic blending of their internal monologues, which was either comforting or deeply strange, and he decided it was both and moved on. He thought, "We are not done yet." Not loudly, not with any particular drama. The words arrived the way long-computed answers finally arrive, with the flat, unlabeled certainty of something that has always been true and simply took this long to surface. He held them for a moment. He nodded to himself slightly, the way you nod when the calculation confirms what you suspected. He stood up and started walking. He walked the bunks and talked in the flat, careful voice he'd learned to use for things that were real and needed to stay real, not a speech voice, not a rallying voice, just a talking voice, bunk to bunk, person to person, the same voice he'd used for 5 years saying names in the evenings. He said the belt situation was bad. He said it was the worst thing that had happened. He said he wasn't going to pretend it wasn't bad, because they'd been lied to enough by enough different parties and deserved better than comfortable untruths. Then he said, "The reason they keep taking us and not killing us is because they haven't finished deciding what to do with us. And that means there's still time. And time is the only currency that matters in this situation, because everything else we need either exists or can be made, but only if we have time to get to it." Some people told him to sit down. He sat down. He kept talking. He moved to the next bunk. Some people told him to stop talking. He stopped for a moment. He started again, more quietly, to the person 2 bunks over who was listening even though they were looking away. Letta Morn caught his eye across the room at some point and gave him the nod, the specific nod she developed for situations where the thing he was doing was obviously right and possibly insane, and necessary regardless. He gave her a slight lift of the chin in return. She went to work on her side of the room. By morning, the camp was not quiet in the same way it had been at noon. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not enough to show up on Kethral monitoring, but the specific silence of people who have decided to wait was different from the silence of people who have stopped. Different weight, different texture. If you knew how to listen for it, you could hear the difference easily. Ergail's morning report noted, population markers, stable. Anomalous, No measurable increase in non-cooperative indicators despite external event transmission. Assessment: uncertain. Urgale requested a meeting with Davin in the 4th year. This was extremely unusual. Camp commanders did not hold individual meetings with detainees unless the meetings were classified as interrogation sessions, which this was not. The summons was delivered through the regular guard rotation with no accompanying classification, which was itself a small bureaucratic novelty. The room was bare. Smooth walls, a low table, 2 seats sized for Kethril that Davin had to somewhat improvise around. Urgale sat across from him with his 4 arms folded in the configuration that, Davin had learned, indicated a senior Kethril was in a state of formal attention rather than operational readiness. His gold-slit eyes studied Davin for a long time before he spoke. "You are the one with the ring," he said. His human standard was careful, functional. "Yes," Davin said. "Describe its function." Davin looked at him for a moment. Then he reached under his collar, lifted the cord over his head, and set the ring on the table between them. It sat there in the flat lighting of the interrogation room, looking like what it was, a small corroded band of metal worth less than nothing. Urgale looked at it. He extended one finger, the smallest manipulator on his lower left arm, and touched the ring very carefully. The way you touch something you suspect is hotter than it looks. "It belonged to someone who died," Davin said. "My grandmother. She was 87 when she died, and she'd worn that ring since before I was born. She loved me. I loved her. She's gone. The ring is—" He stopped. He turned the ring slightly on the table. "The ring is proof that she was real, that she was here, that she mattered, that what she left behind me, for starters, is worth something because she thought so." Urgale withdrew his finger. He looked at Davin. "This is a grief processing mechanism," he said. "Biological. Material object as symbolic anchor for loss integration." "Sure," Davin said. "Or it's the thing that keeps me from stopping." Silence. The Kethril commander's layered harmonics, the undertone that carried emotional valence, shifted in a way Davin couldn't parse but could feel, the way you feel a sub-bass frequency more in your sternum than your ears. "You have prevented 307 individuals from reaching a state of operational non-function," Urgale said, "through sustained behavioral intervention, using an object that has no physical properties relevant to the outcome, by transmitting something the object does not possess." Davin picked the ring up. He put it back around his neck. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right. My database has no category for this." "No," Davin said, "I don't imagine it does." He was returned to the compound. Urgale sat in the empty room and looked at the table where the ring had been. After a time, he filed a high-priority alert to the High Court Scholar Dispatch Office, marked with the only flag he had available that seemed even remotely appropriate. Species contact anomaly. Recommend direct examination. The court scholar's name was G.H. Vental, and she arrived in the 5th year, and she watched. She watched in the way that certain rare and specifically gifted observers watch, not evaluating, not categorizing, not measuring against existing frameworks, simply accumulating, with a patience that made the accumulation itself into a form of respect. She watched Davin say names in the evenings. She watched the ring travel and return. She watched Letta Morn run her navigator's calculations in the dirt with a stick, working out potential egress routes that she openly acknowledged would never be used but which she continued refining anyway, because the work kept her sharp and sharp people kept other people sharp. She watched Oren, who had held the ring during a fever that should have broken him, get up the following morning and eat breakfast, and then spend the afternoon teaching 2 new arrivals how to speak enough Kethril to navigate the ration distribution system without provoking the guards. After 3 weeks of watching, she came to Davin. "Do you know what it means," she said, in careful formal human standard, "to us, when something is given back?" He met her eyes. He had learned, in 5 years of living with Kethril at close range, to read the gold-slit gaze more accurately than he'd imagined possible when he arrived. What he saw in her eyes was not the operational assessment of the guards or the administrative concern of Urgale. It was something closer to the expression his daughter had the morning she'd worked out a math problem she'd been stuck on for 2 days, a specific quality of arrival, of landing somewhere new and recognizing the ground. "Tell me," he said. She told him about the ceremony, the bonding object, the carrying back, the fundamental social architecture of Kethril grief, the return as the thing that makes loss legible, that seals it, that allows the lineage to continue without a wound that never closes. She told him it had been in place for longer than their recorded history, which meant longer than writing, which meant it was older than any system they'd developed for preserving memory. It was that old. It was that important. She looked at the cord around his neck. "You have been performing this ceremony," she said, "for 5 years. For people who are not your lineage, for people who were strangers to you before this place, in a context in which you had nothing. You gave them the object. You required its return. Every return was..." She paused. She was working in a second language and had reached the edge of what that language could carry. Every return was the ceremony, but performed wrong, or not wrong, performed in a direction we had no word for. Not for the dead. For the living. He thought about it. He thought about Letta's hands on the ring in the morning giving it back. Oren's hands, Jorav's, Tesh and Orem, the specific weight of the transfer, the specific quality of the exchange. "A promise that they're still here," he said, "that they still count, that the thing they're holding on to is worth holding on to." She looked at him with her gold-slit eyes, and in the harmonics beneath her silence, he felt the same sub-bass vibration he'd felt in Urgale's interrogation room, deeper this time, more resonant, like a bell struck in a very large space. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." The 6th year. Negotiations, though nobody told the prisoners. Letta mourned sources. She'd built a network of informational threads through 6 years of patient observation, and carefully established relationships with 3 specific guards who had, independently and for different reasons, found themselves unable to maintain full professional indifference. Told her the framework. Earth had not surrendered. Earth had held. The inter-system defense had been catastrophically costly by any metric but the only one that mattered, which was whether the line had moved. The line had not moved. The Kethril High Court was in extended conference. The forward push had stalled. Davin heard this and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Not relief, not exactly, not yet. Something more like the physical sensation of removing a load you've carried so long you've reorganized your body around it. The absence of the weight briefly more disorienting than the weight had been. His own muscles, still calibrated for the pressure, pushing against nothing. He sat with it for a while. He turned the ring. He allowed himself, for the first time in 6 years, to think about Sorrel and Pell in the present tense. Not as the frozen image in the photograph the Kethril had taken. Not as the people they'd been when he left. As people who were moving through time right now, today, in real minutes, growing slightly different, learning things, having arguments and meals and mornings, getting older in the way that people get older when they're alive and moving through the world. Real in the specific way that only things in motion through time are real. He turned the ring for a long time. He thought about what he was going to do when this was over. He thought about all the names he'd said in the evenings, and what it would mean to say them in a different kind of space. He thought about his grandmother's voice, and what it was that she had actually been trying to keep, with the envelope and the ring and the single word inside. That evening he gathered the nearest bunks, Letta, Oren, Jorav, Sion, the brothers Tesh and Orem, 3 others, and he said, "I want to tell you about my grandmother. I've carried her ring for 14 years and I've never actually told any of you who she was. Her name was HFY. She was born in a coastal city that smelled of salt and low tide and the specific dazzle of working boats. She was raised in a family that was mostly noise and mostly love, which she said were usually the same thing. She had worked her entire adult life as a music teacher, 41 years of it, every age and level and degree of natural ability, every variety of enthusiasm and reluctance, every child who wanted to play and every parent who wanted them to want to play and every 12-year-old who would rather be literally anywhere else. She had a phrase she used when students gave up on a piece they found too difficult. She'd say, "You haven't earned the ending yet. Keep going." The ring had been hers since before she was married, her mother's before that. Worn every day for 60 years, on the hand she used to play, which was why it was thinner on the inner edge, 60 years of the keys wearing it down from the other side. When he finished, Leda Morn said, "HFY." Not a question, a statement. The name out loud in the space between them said the way he had said 300 names over 6 years of evenings, as acknowledgement, as witness, as the small act of saying someone existed and mattered and was not forgotten. Oren said it after her, then Jorev, then Sion. Around the circle, all 9 people, saying the name of a woman they had never met, who had died 14 years ago, who had left behind a ring and a grandson, and the phrase that had probably, without anyone meaning it to, kept 61 people alive in a processing camp on the 3rd moon of the Veth system. G.H. Vental was at the edge of the room. She had gotten very good at not being noticed at the edge of rooms. She heard every word. She wrote for 4 hours afterward, in the layered formal script of the High Court Archives, a document that had no precedent in the archive's history and no existing section to be filed under. She created a new section. She named it in the old court speech, using a phrase that translated roughly as, "The ceremony the living perform for the living, performed for strangers, in a place of nothing with an object worth nothing, that is worth everything." She flagged it for direct delivery to the gatekeeper prime. He read it the same evening it arrived. He read it twice. He set it down. He sat for a long time in his study in the oldest part of the High Court Palace, surrounded by records and histories and the accumulated weight of 3 centuries of his office, and he was quiet in a specific way. Then he began to make arrangements. The 7th year. The war ended the way most things that have gone on long enough end, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small conclusions that accumulated until the thing itself became impossible to maintain. Withdrawals, announced to no one, that left holes in the occupation. Silences in broadcast frequencies. Shifts in Kethral Guard behavior that Leda Morn tracked with her navigator's habit of measuring everything and noted, 3 months before the official end, as significant. The camp on Veth 3 was informed of its status change not by the Kethral, but by a Terran fleet vessel that appeared in orbit one morning and broadcast on all frequencies, in plain human standard, "We are here. We are coming." Davin was sitting in the main compound when the broadcast came through. He had the ring in his hand off the cord, because the latest cord had finally given up after 7 years of daily use, and he hadn't yet found a replacement. He was sitting with it in his palm, a habit that had grown over years without his noticing, turning it over and over with one finger. He heard the broadcast. He didn't move for a long time. Around him, the compound erupted. Leda Morn made a sound that was entirely unlike anything he'd heard from her in 7 years, which was fitting, because the circumstances were also unlike anything in 7 years. Oren and the brothers grabbed each other. Sion sat down abruptly and put her face in her hands. People were talking and laughing, and someone was crying with the specific uninhibited abandon of someone who has held it together for exactly as long as necessary, and not 1 second more. Davin sat in the middle of it with the ring in his palm and the empty cord draped over his knee, and he watched it all, and he felt something that was not quite joy and not quite relief and not quite grief, and was all 3 of them at once, layered in a chord that the human language has no clean word for, and that he thought, sitting there, was probably what the Kethral harmonics actually sounded like from the inside. He found a new cord that afternoon from a piece of a dismantled bunk frame. He threaded the ring and put it back around his neck. He went to stand in the long line for fleet processing and waited patiently while the officer with the clipboard worked through the population. Name, origin, condition, next of kin, contact, priority, any belongings to declare. He held up the ring. The officer looked at it with the expression of someone who has been looking at things for a very long time and has stopped seeing most of them. He wrote something, stamped a form, handed Davin a packet, moved on. Davin put the ring back under his collar and went outside. The sky above Veth 3 was the wrong color, a deep amber from years of upper atmosphere particulates from the facility decommissioning, but it was enormous. He hadn't seen an enormous sky in 7 years. He stood under it for a long time, with his face up and his eyes open, and he let it be enormous. 3 months after his return to Earth, the summons came. He was home. He was relearning his home the way you relearn anything after long absence, slowly, in details, surprised repeatedly by things that had changed and by things that hadn't. The kitchen table was warped from years of damp and he loved it. Pell was 12 and had her mother's eyes and his jaw, and had developed, in 7 years of growing up without him, a directness of manner that startled him and delighted him every time he encountered it. She asked him questions he wasn't ready for and waited, without fidgeting, for him to work out his answers. She reminded him of someone. He told her about her great-great-grandmother. Pell asked to hold the ring. He gave it to her for an evening, and she gave it back in the morning carefully with both hands and said, "I think I understand." He wasn't sure she did quite. He wasn't sure he did quite, and he'd had 7 years to think about it. Sorrel was different and the same and beautiful and difficult in ways that were different from the ways she'd been beautiful and difficult before, which was correct, because they had both been living through time without each other and had changed by separate amounts in separate directions. The adjustment was not seamless. It was not supposed to be seamless. They sat at the warped kitchen table many evenings and talked until the talking found the real things underneath the adjustment. And then they talked about those, and some evenings it was easy, and some evenings it was very hard, and all of it was better than the alternative. He was, in other words, not looking for anything more to do. But the summons came through the Fleet Diplomatic Office, classified extraordinary, a designation he'd never seen used in 14 years of fleet service, and the officer who delivered it said, "Sir, the Kethral High Court has formally requested the presence of registered civilian Davin Voss at the Court of Reception in the Kethral capital. The stated purpose is a pause, the pause of a person reading something they don't entirely follow. The resolution of an outstanding object matter." "An object matter," Davin said. "That's what it says, sir." He told Sorrel that evening across the warped table. She listened with the recalibrating expression she'd developed for things that required her to adjust a model she'd already adjusted twice. "Do you need to go?" she said. "I think so," he said. "I think it's not finished." She looked at the ring cord around his neck. Then she looked at him with the expression she had for things she understood completely and wished she didn't, because understanding them meant acknowledging something complicated. "A Shav Voss would say you haven't earned the ending yet," she said. He looked at his wife. He thought about the words, the specific ones, the grandmother's phrase, worn smooth by decades of use on music students who wanted to stop before the piece was done. And he felt the truth of it settle in, the way things settle when they're the right shape for the space they occupy. "Yeah," he said, "she would." The Kethral High Court occupied a structure so old the stone had been worn smooth by the passage of 10,000 years of hands. The chamber of reception was a wide, low-ceilinged oval that seated 500 in concentric rings descending to a central offering table of black stone, polished to a surface that reflected the amber light of the capital's sky like a mirror. 500 Kethral, war chiefs and chancellors and court scholars and high scribes. Every rank from the frontier commanders who had run the outer operations to the oldest archivists who had not left the palace in a generation. Every gold-slit eye in the room turned toward him as he walked through the entrance, and he was aware of the sound of it. Not a human sound, not an audible reaction, but the shift in the room's harmonic undertone that he had learned, over 7 years of close proximity, to register with his sternum rather than his ears. He walked the length of the chamber alone. He had refused an escort. He had refused diplomatic protocol and a formal uniform and any apparatus that would have made this into the kind of event it wasn't. He wore his own clothes. He walked on his own feet. He was aware of the ring against his sternum, the familiar weight of it, the cord that was starting to show its first signs of wear and would need replacement in another year. He thought, walking, about Letta Morn, who was back on Earth running navigation courses for new fleet recruits, and had sent him a message the day before that said, simply, "Bring it home." He thought about Oren, who had found his family and spent 3 months relearning how to be a person who had a family. He thought about 307 names, all the ones he could still recite in order without stopping, and the names of all the ones he'd said in the evenings, the ones who hadn't come through. He said a few of them to himself as he walked, quietly, under the watching eyes of 500 Kethril who had no framework for what they were witnessing. He reached the offering table. He reached under his collar. He lifted the cord over his head. He set the ring on the black stone. The chamber went silent in a way that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that silence was the only adequate container for. 500 harmonics dropping to zero simultaneously. The kind of quiet that is weight. G.H. Vental spoke from the head of the inner ring in Kethril, and the translator drone in his ear rendered it. "You are returning the bonding object." "Yes," he said. "To whom?" He looked at the ring, a corroded circle thin in 2 places, light showing through. 14 years old in his possession, older than that in the world, worth nothing, worth everything. "To everyone who held it," he said. His voice was level. He had practiced this and then set the practice aside and decided to say what was true in the plainest words he could find, because that was the only kind of saying that would carry the weight of the thing he was trying to carry. All of them. The ones who made it through and the ones who didn't. They should know, all of them, the whole chain of people who held this in the dark when they needed something to hold. They should know that they made it matter. That they were worth holding it for. I'm giving it back so that all of them know they existed. They mattered. None of it was lost. The translator drone was quiet for a moment, longer than a translation took. Then it spoke. And the harmonic undertone of the chamber, the layered Kethril emotional architecture, the 500 voice chord that had been at zero, changed. He felt it in his chest, a low, enormous note, sustained and deepening. He didn't know the Kethril term for what he was doing. He didn't know that 500 of the most formidable military minds in the outer systems were recognizing, simultaneously, something they had no category for: a species performing the oldest ceremony in Kethril culture, without knowing its name, without being taught it, without even knowing it existed. Performing it for strangers. Performing it for the living as well as the dead. Performing it in a direction the ceremony had never been designed to go, backward and forward and sideways all at once, for 7 years, with nothing but a corroded ring and the stubbornness of a species that refused to stop seeing each other. He didn't know that the Gatekeeper Prime had not wept since the sundering. He heard the sound the Gatekeeper Prime made. It had no name in any language. It didn't need one. In the long silence that followed, while the chamber held the weight of what had passed through it, Davin stood at the offering table and looked at the ring on the black stone and felt, for the first time since he'd stepped off the fleet ship onto familiar ground 3 months ago, that the thing was finished. Or not finished, that wasn't the right word. The word was complete. The ending had been earned. He picked up the ring. He put it back around his neck. Because that was the ceremony too. Give it, take it back. The meaning was in the giving and the taking back. The return and the return and the return again. The proof that the thing persisted, that the giving didn't diminish the giver, that what was offered came back always because something had been honored, and honoring a thing made it real, and real things did not disappear. HFY Stories walked him out through the long stone corridor, where 10,000 years of hands had worn the walls smooth. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Go home," he said, "relearn my kitchen." She was quiet for a moment. He had been to this corridor before, in all the months of observation, and he could hear in her silence the harmonics she wasn't voicing, the ones that would have taken an hour to render in human standard, and that he understood anyway, with the same deep body comprehension he'd developed for Kethral emotional layering over 7 years of involuntary close contact. "The ring," she said, "you will take it with you." "Yes," he said. She made a sound that the translator rendered as affirmation, but he could hear in the undertone of it, the layer beneath the layer, the frequency his sternum registered rather than his ears, the deep harmonic meaning of the thing. Of course, it could not have been any other way. The ceremony is the return, and the return is the ceremony, and both of them require that the thing persist. The ring is not the ring. The ring is the proof that the ring comes back. He said nothing in response. He had understood it for a while now. He walked out of the high court of the Kethral into the amber-copper light of the capital city, where the sky was enormous and wrong and exactly right, and he walked toward the transit port and his ship and the long way home, carrying a rusted ring that weighed almost nothing and had held 307 people together across 7 years of systematic pressure that had been designed specifically to take them apart. His grandmother had a word for things like that. She called them what they were: practice. Every hard thing was practice for the next hard thing, and every small act of holding on, every ring threaded on a cord, every name said out loud in an evening, every borrowed night of faith repaid by morning, was a rehearsal for the thing that would eventually require all of it at once. "You haven't earned the ending yet. Keep going." He had kept going. He was still going. He walked. The amber sky turned slowly toward dark. Behind him, in a stone amphitheater older than writing, 500 Kethral warriors sat with the silence of people who have discovered something they will spend the rest of their lives thinking about, a species that performed the oldest ceremony without knowing it, for strangers with nothing, because the act itself was the point. Because humans, it turned out, had always known. The people who love us don't go anywhere. They just go quiet. And if you pay attention, the right kind of attention, the specific demanding kind that requires everything, you can hear them still. Even in the dark. Even in the nothing. Even when all you have is a rusted ring and a cord that's starting to fray. Even then. There is a postscript to this that HFY Stories included in her court archive document, in the section she filed under the untranslatable category, the one that meant, roughly, the thing that has no category. She noted it not as a conclusion but as an observation, filed alongside the primary record so that whoever came after her would have it. She wrote, "In all our centuries of contact with other species, 12 civilizations examined, 7 in sustained conflict, 3 in negotiated coexistence, we have never encountered the practice we observed in the human population of VETH-3 processing facility. The practice is, at its core, the ceremony of return. It is the oldest ceremony we have. We believe it to be the foundation on which all other social architecture rests, because without the return of the bonding object, grief cannot be completed, and without completed grief, no lineage can continue. We assumed we were alone in this. We assumed it was ours. The human Davin Voss performed this ceremony for 7 years without knowing it existed. He performed it for strangers. He performed it in a context of total resource deprivation, which is precisely the context in which such a ceremony should be impossible, because the ceremony requires something to give. He had nothing. He gave the only thing he had, and they gave it back, and he gave it again. I asked him on his way out of the capital how he had known to do this. He looked at the ring in his hand and he said, "I didn't. I just couldn't stop." This is the part I have thought about most in the years since. Not the ceremony itself, though the ceremony broke us open in ways we are still accounting for. What I have thought about is the phrase, "I couldn't stop." In our tradition, the ceremony of return is a choice, a conscious act, a duty known and fulfilled with full awareness of its weight. The Kethra warrior who carries the bonding object home across a battlefield, and a star system does so knowing the name of what they are doing, knowing its necessity, knowing the exact cost and the exact nature of the debt they are repaying. Davin Voss did not know any of those things. He did not know the name. He did not know the tradition. He did not know that what he was doing had a precise shape and a precise purpose, and had been doing the same necessary work for longer than his species had been writing things down. He just couldn't stop. This is what I believe humans mean when they use the word love, not the feeling, the impossibility of stopping. The thing you keep doing in the dark when there is no reason to continue except that the alternative is not being yourself anymore, and that alternative is unacceptable, and so you continue, because you are the kind of thing that continues. We spent a century believing humans were simple. We were not wrong about the parts we measured. We were wrong about the parts we hadn't thought to measure. We know now. Davin Voss lived a long life. He went home and relearned his kitchen and his wife and his daughter. He did not become famous for what happened in the camp on Veth 3, because he didn't want to be famous for it, and because the thing that happened in the camp was not the kind of thing that photographs well or translates into a memorial speech without losing most of what made it real. He continued to say names out loud, not publicly, not on a schedule. He said them when he thought of them in the car while washing dishes, on the long walks he took in the mornings when the light was right. 307 names kept live in his memory like a flame kept burning in a vessel. He added to them over the years inevitably as the people who mattered to him moved through time and eventually stopped. He said them. He kept them in the air where they could be heard. The ring his grandmother had worn for 60 years eventually became too fragile to wear. One of the thin sections cracked. He had a jeweler stabilize it, a careful process, the smallest possible intervention to keep the thing intact. He didn't wear it anymore after that. He kept it in a small wooden box, and he opened the box sometimes and turned the ring in his fingers and thought about a Shav Voss who had played piano for 41 years and worn this ring through all of it and left it behind for him to carry, knowing, she must have known, that he would need something to hold. Pell inherited the box when he died. She kept it on her desk for the rest of her life, in the room where she worked, which was a kind of work that required a great deal of thinking about what humans owed each other. She opened it sometimes. The ring passed to her daughter, then further. The Kethral, in the years following the treaty and the long, slow thaw of what came after, incorporated a new element into their ceremony of return. A small variation. Not a replacement, the original ceremony was kept intact, as it had been for longer than writing. But alongside it, a companion practice, the ceremony of the living, for the ones who are still here and still carrying something and need to know that what they carry is real. They named it. They named it in the old court speech, using the phrasing G.H. Vental had filed in her archive under the untranslatable section. The closest human rendering of the name is the ring that comes back. It is practiced across 14 worlds now. It requires only two things, something to give and the faith that it will be returned. The object doesn't matter. The faith is everything. A logistics specialist on the third moon of a distant system, swallowing a ring so small that no one thought to look for it, did not intend to change the ceremonies of a civilization that had been carrying its grief in one precise an ancient shape for 300 years. He just couldn't stop giving it back. And it kept coming home,